Tonight our lesson is Luke chapter 1. We've kind of set a general goal for ourselves of a chapter a week as we would look at Luke in survey. If we have discussion, we won't do that much, and that'll be okay. Also, if we have very many chapters like chapters 1 and 2, well, chapter 2 only, it goes easy on us, only has 52 verses. Chapter 1 has 80 verses. And so when you read Luke chapter 1, it's sort of like one of those long Psalms. Matter of fact, it reminds us quite a bit of the Psalms because there are two sections in it that basically are New Testament Psalms. But a lot of information in Luke chapter 1. We start with the prologue, and if you look at your handout, the outline, you see that we start with the outline of each chapter. So we'll have in this chapter 4 verses of prologue, of which we said a decent amount during the introductory material of Luke's intention to study these things and his own words, investigate carefully, look into, and put them in consecutive order. And so Luke will start with these two births, the birth of John and the birth of Jesus. And so John's birth will be foretold. Of course, John had been long foretold. How long had John the Baptist, his coming in ministry, how long ago had that been foretold? It's in Malachi. We definitely have Malachi quoted in regards to the work of John the Baptist. And that had only been, 320 years ago. And so if God has promised a thing, and it's 320 years since that promise is made, and it hasn't come yet, do you think it's going to come? If God's promise was 320 years ago, and God's promise has not yet occurred, the fulfillment, do you believe that that promise will come true? It really wasn't meant to be a trick question. Turned into one, I guess.
A lot of people would say no, it's not going to happen.
A lot of people.
Yeah, 300 years.
Right.
That's not going to come true.
And what will be the attitude of the faithful about this? It will. It hasn't yet, but it will. And it's not just that this promise was 320 years old. When are the other prophecies of John, about John, when are they given? Not by Malachi at the close of the Old Testament, but who else prophesied of John besides Malachi? The voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the paths of the Lord. It's a very similar prophecy to Malachi. Was by Isaiah. How long before the time of the Gospels was Isaiah? Yeah, the round number is about 7. Yeah, 6, 7. Okay, so we've got a promise. We've got a promise twice repeated. 300 years apart. A promise is given. 350 years later, promise is repeated. 350 years later, you're waiting on it, and what happens? Angel appears and says, that's going to happen at your house. Now, when that occurs, how surprised is John's father, Zacharias? He's very surprised, isn't he? Because even if you believe the promise that the Elijah will come as a forerunner to go before the Messiah, do you think that's going to happen today and in your house with you and your wife? That you're going to be the dad of the new Elijah? Well, what was Zacharias's response? Yes, he asked, how will I know this for sure? How can I be certain about this? Depending on your translation. So we have that story. And then the next story we're told is the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary. And Gabriel appears to Mary, and he appears to her as, we don't know the circumstance. Vision in the night in her bedroom, as she's walking out to the well to get some water, as she's doing whatever domestic duties a young woman in the house would be, given that there doesn't seem to be anybody else present. And what does the angel Gabriel say to her? Just somebody summarize. What's Gabriel say to Mary? You're going to have a baby. And it's going to be the work of God. And what does she say? She says almost the same words as Zacharias, which is, how will I know? But she must have said them in a totally different spirit. She said, how could this be? Because I've not been with a man. That's verse 34 to summarize. And he says, well, it's going to happen when the Holy Spirit comes upon you and it will overshadow you. And you're going to have this baby that'll be conceived by God. And this one will be born. He will be called the Son of God. So you're going to bear into the world the Son of God. Now, let's think about these two announcements, kind of compare and contrast. They're both after a period of God not speaking to the Jews by prophet that we have record of. There's no record of God speaking by prophet with a message to the people or even a message to any individuals for about 325 years. Depending on the exact date of Malachi, it might have been 305 years, it might have been 340 or 50 years, but maybe as many as 360. But in any case, in 300 plus years, for sure, probably 325 or 30 years, God's not given a message to the people. If we remember in our introduction or our intertestament class, we talked about some of the things with the Maccabees, and we talked about various things that happened at that time in the recordings. Even in the Apocrypha, in those apocryphal books, there are no credible accounts of God speaking to people. And so they didn't even have fables floating around that God is speaking to us here and there and other things. There's just, when we call it the period of silence, we really mean that God hasn't spoken for a long time, right? Again, as we did study from Daniel, God was not silent about the period. He prophesied about what was coming, but he prophesied about it before it happened. So during that whole period, we are, I think, totally on solid ground talking about God's silence and biblical silence. So after 325, 30 years, we get an announcement. We get two announcements. We get one that's met with some unbelief. Who was the one that met it with unbelief? Zachariah. And how old was he? Older, right? Older guy. And we don't know exactly how old, but it does talk about him being somewhat advanced in years, enough that he and his wife have passed the normal age of childbearing, right? That's part of the story. So he's a gentleman of advanced years, and he's a priest, and he's in the temple. Now, if God's going to break his silence, wouldn't a priest in the temple who sees an angel, wouldn't that seem to be an adequate way to break the silence? A good way to say, hey, Jewish folks, I'm back in town, right? Not that he was ever far from us, I know, but isn't that a good way? And wouldn't that sort of be, an expected way, or at least a probable way that God would again speak to his people, right? Because if you're a priest and you're a devout and righteous man who follows and knows the law, should it be completely surprising if maybe while you're doing your priestly duties in the temple at Jerusalem, God sends you a messenger, right? He's the right guy, he's in the right place, but how does he meet the message? With some unbelief, right? Now, the second message is what? A private message. It's a message that is now through the Gospels shared with the world. But when Mary got the message, it wasn't a public message, was it? You've seen these people who buy these billboards and they put them up in major cities, and it says, "Be nice to each other," and then it's signed God. Have you seen those type of billboards? The announcement to Mary, is this a freeway billboard for all to see? It's somewhere in and about her house, right? Somewhere in the domestic situation where she is doing the things that a young woman would be doing, that an angel appears to her. And where she live? She's from Nazareth. Now, do angels appear to young ladies going about their domestic duties in Nazareth? Is that how the message of God comes? We wouldn't normally think so, would we? But when the message comes to her, what does she say? She says, "I'm the Lord's servant. May it be done to me according to your word." Now, let's explore this a little further. If we were going to ask people in town, ask for people's opinion, say, "Hey, do you know somebody who's really faithful, really dedicated to God, a good, true servant of God?" And they say, "Yeah, I know a lot of those. We know this priest down the road. We know this priest. He's a really good guy. He is righteous. Him and his wife are faithful people. They have been faithful for years. They are kind people. They are hospitable people. They are lovely people. They are faithful people. Zacharias and his wife Elizabeth, you should meet them. They are faithful people." Would people say things like that about them as described in the text? Yeah. Well, he's a paragon of faith, right? Who would say, "Yeah, I know this young girl. Nobody's heard of her, but I know this young girl over there." And how old do we think Mary was at this time? Usually thought to be not even 20. I have seen a few things in various studies where they start talking about 14, 15, 16-year-old Mary. It turns out that cultural research, historic research, shows that the Jews at this time, they very seldom had girls marry that young. The girls were marrying, but a lot of them as older teenagers. And so on the underside of 20 is probably where she would be. I don't think that these pictures of a really young, just mid-teenage Mary are probably not right. We don't know. But probably she's 17, 18 years old. And so how many churches today would she still be off with the youth group? And who is this great paragon of faith in this chapter? It's Mary. And so you go to most churches, there's an older preacher, and there's a youth group, and most people say, "Hey, who's the faithful people here? Who are the ones really dedicated to God's will?" How many people are pointing to different people in the youth group? And how many people are pointing to older guys in the ministry? But in this story, where's the faith? Where's the stronger faith? Now, again, Zacharias, we don't want to bang on him too hard. I don't know. What would you do if an angel showed up to you as you're worshiping and gave you a message after so many years? And he does give an inspired song of praise to God when this is over. But we note that absolute, unwavering faith of Mary and the wavering faith for a bit. This is sort of, again, it's kind of unfair to point out this weakness in Zacharias, because how many good things are said about him in the text versus, there is a moment of waver. One last thing, and then I'll get off of this point, unless you want to discuss it some more. What would the reaction, when the announcement comes to pass to Zacharias, what's the announcement? "You, sir, are going to have a baby boy with your older barren wife," right? And when people see that this is happening, and after all, who is he going to tell? After he's not going to tell anybody, right, for a while, because he can't talk. But how are people going to know that this is coming true? It's going to start to show. Now, when it starts to show for older Elizabeth, right? I don't picture her as elderly by any means, right? But she's an older lady, like her husband was an older. When this older lady starts to show, and it's obvious that she's pregnant, and we know what kind of character she has and what relationship she has with her husband, and everybody knows who's the dad, right? What is the reaction around town when Zacharias starts going around town, going about his daily duties and going about his social obligations and seeing his friends and his family? What is the reaction when they find out your wife is pregnant? What's the reaction? It's not normal. Right?
If they were somewhat of the God-fearing people that came out of this atmosphere, they might say, well, this is just a blessing from God.
What do you say when people are pregnant? Congratulations, sir. Man, you've waited forever. Hey, let me buy you whatever they buy you, right? Did they give cigars back then? I don't know. What did they do? How do you, Mazel Tov, right? Did they speak Yiddish? I don't know. But it's a Mazel Tov time, right? It's congratulations, sir. You are blessed of God. And the longer this goes and the more his wife shows, and it's obvious that, hey, this is a real deal, the more, wow, look how good God was to those folks, right? Okay. So what's in his immediate future? Obvious blessing and congratulations. Now Mary, young woman, not yet married. She becomes in a family way, and she's not yet with family, right? Have we ever seen that happen? We have. What's the reaction? It's not congratulations, Mary, is it? What's the reaction? Ooh. Girls, I don't want y'all to hang out with Mary anymore. Please don't talk to her. If you see her down at the bakery, if you see her down at the well, don't be rude, don't gawk, don't stare, but I need to tell you, y'all don't hang out with Mary no more, right? What's in her future as this blessing of God comes? Yeah. What is we don't know if it was a story that was actually in the time of the gospel or the generation after. But there is a very old story that goes back nearly to New Testament times about the Jewish reaction to the claim that Jesus was born of a virgin. And do you think it credits Mary as a woman of virtue? It does not. It's a claim that Mary was unfaithful and that there was an anonymous Roman soldier who was the father of Jesus. Now, how insulting is that to Mary and to her honor and to what the Word of God says? That's just about as insulting as possible, right? And now, again, I don't know if that story went back to the exact generation of Jesus, but we know it goes back within one or two. She is not, as the promise of the angel comes to pass and comes true, she will not be the subject of much congratulations, will she? As a matter of fact, when Joseph finds out about these things, what does Joseph wish to do? Put her away. Quietly. He's a decent guy. Can you imagine how heartbroken he must have been to have come to that conclusion that that's what he should do? Right? Because obviously he doesn't want to publicly shun and shame her additionally, so he just wants to quietly end this and move on. Because, I mean, what happens to what if your fiance shows up in a family way before you've been a family? Right? And what stops him from doing that? Another angel appears. And so we notice his great faith his great faith to do this. Now, when these things are accomplished, and when the story is told of how and why and all these things, what do all the faithful say about Mary and Joseph and about Zacharias and Elizabeth? What do all the faithful say? It's of God. This is a great blessing. How great a blessing was it that she becomes the mother of Jesus, right? And so if we view these things through the eye of faith, every one of these people is blessed. And who's the one who's considered most blessed of all? It's Mary, right? She's the most blessed. She is the one who the angel comes and says, "Hail, favored one," right? But that is the conclusion of the faithful. If you're unfaithful now or then, if you're unfaithful down the street or you're unfaithful down the street today from this church, what do you say about her? Oh, there's no way, right? There's no way. And so there's a stark difference in how the faithful view this and how the unfaithful view this. Then we also note then that Mary goes to Elizabeth's house. And that's a very interesting encounter because Elizabeth sees her and says, "Blessed are you among women, and your child be blessed." That's 2:42. And that is how the faithful view her from now on, right? And Elizabeth is the first one who is recorded is giving the blessing to Mary and blessing Mary for carrying the child of God in her womb. And we note that Mary goes and spends there a number of months, right? And we know that Mary is about 6 months behind in pregnancy from Elizabeth. And she went there and spent a number of months. But basically, it appears that she stayed there with Elizabeth until the birth of John. So it looks like she either left right before the birth of John or I think quite likely she stayed there right till John was born. It says in verse 56, she stayed there 3 months before she returned home. We would note, and you think about a woman who's in the plight or situation, if we want to say it less negatively, we think of a woman in the situation that Mary is in, where even her fiance, without an angelic message, wasn't accepting how she appeared to be. This would be, wouldn't it, at Zacharias and Elizabeth's house, wouldn't this be the one house in all of the land where she would be the most received? Because who knows more than Zacharias and Elizabeth of God's dealing, of God causing these pregnancies, of God causing these babies to be on their way. And so I just think of this for Mary as what a wonderful refuge that would have been. Can you imagine her trying to tell her mom, "Hey, Mom, I'm pregnant, but don't worry." We just don't know how that would have gone. But we know, again, with Joseph, we know without an angelic intervention, it would not have been, it was not received until the intervention came. And I don't think do you think the angel went around intervening with everybody Mary knew? We don't think that, do we? And so she has this wonderful refuge in the house of godly people who understand her situation truly better than anybody else possibly could have. And just one exhortation on that. Let us, in our homes, be a place of refuge for people, especially those trying to be faithful to God. Let's be a refuge for them like Elizabeth and Zacharias was for Mary. Now, that doesn't mean, husbands, you can't speak for 3 months. That's not quite required. But may have made it more enjoyable for her to be there since the man of the house couldn't talk. All right, so I've talked for a while. Questions, comments on that, on these, especially on the announcements of these two births? I don't know if they knew that yet, but yeah, there are in these first two chapters, there's this big theme of announcements and becoming more and more and more public, and God making these preparations so that people would know something is astir.
So, for these two individuals to get these announcements from Gabriel, maybe it's like Mary was with Jesus. They kept these things in their mind
Right.
and ponder what's being said. Is this true? I don't know, being in that position, what I would say.
Yeah.
But still, but even so, there must have been something different about the appearance of Gabriel to notice that he's not your ordinary common Jew that would
Right.
come and go.
So what we have, and I really think it's a big theme in these first two chapters in particular, we start with these announcements, and they just start. They crescendo. The first thing we have is we have a singular angel speaking to a singular priest in the privacy of the temple, right? Because did people hang out in the temple all day long? There are people in the courtyard doing all kinds of things. But in the actual building itself, he's the only guy there. So it's one priest, but he's doing the very work of God when the angel appears. And again, he knew the prophecies, but to think that it's today and it's my family, that seemed to be a bit of a struggle. Then Mary, a singular appearance. We're not told in Luke, but we're told in Matthew that there's the appearance to Joseph. So the angel appeared to Zacharias, Mary, and the angel appears to Joseph. Here in verse 46, we have the first, with Mary's song of praise, often called the Magnificat. We have the first person, because we've had angelic messages. We have Mary give an inspired message. We have Mary give an inspired message with Elizabeth, and that's private, or not exactly one-on-one. I don't think we should think, because as Mary comes to Elizabeth's house, who's going to be there to greet her? Well, all the ladies of the household, right? And maybe some other ladies who are friends of the family or other relatives. But it's among the women of this house, right? So there's a few people. So the women in the house of Elizabeth are the first people in 350 years to hear another human being give an inspired message of God. And then a few months later, when John is born, what does Zacharias do with all the friends and family that are gathered for the circumcision and naming of John? His tongue is loosed, and he gives prophecy. And so the first two prophecies, one is in the domestic with the ladies of the house by Mary. One is quite a bit more public, but still, it's a family gathering. And would the birth of this child to the aged priest, would that maybe draw a little bit more than the normal birth ceremony, circumcision and naming? Probably, right? And so there's a decent crowd, but still, it's in his backyard, right? Or it's at the local synagogue or community center. It's not widespread, but there starts to be these percolations of things. And then in chapter 2, there's an announcement. When Jesus is born, there's an announcement by what? A whole host of angels. To whom? The shepherds out at night. And what do those shepherds do? They go to town that night and say, we're here to find the baby that was born, right? Because what do the people in Bethlehem know by prophecy? Where's the Messiah going to be born? In Bethlehem. And they knew that, right? Do you think they ever wondered, hey, my kid was born in Bethlehem. I wonder if my kid will be the Messiah. But then these shepherds who are unrelated to this family. These shepherds come in, and what do they tell everybody they're looking for? They would tell what the angel said. And so do you think that would get people's notice? Yeah. And so we've got public things. And then getting on into chapter 2, what happens when Jesus goes to the temple? Prophetess and a prophet. There's two. There's both a man and a woman who both give prophecy in front of whom? Everybody who was there. And when we think about the things that happen in the temple, but the very first time Jesus shows up in the temple, and how much teaching is done in the temple, the very first time Jesus shows up in the temple, there's a prophetess and a prophet who both start talking about this baby. And then in Luke 2, what's the one other story? He advanced 12 years into the future. What happens? You're back in the temple. Now we got a 12-year-old who's doing what? He's teaching. How is he teaching? In this text it talks about he's amazing. They're amazed. And so there's this theme through these 2 chapters of God's revelation occurring more regularly and God's revelation occurring more publicly. And this is the end of the time of silence, right? And so how many people are thinking about and remembering that night the shepherds came to town talking about the Messiah? How many people are remembering about the prophet and the prophetess? How many people are remembering about the old priest and his son named John? And then a guy named John appears in the wilderness who's the mighty preacher and great prophet of God. And so this theme of an unfolding of revelation, a knowledge being spread, and these little seeds. And Luke said in his prologue, I investigated everything carefully, right? And so I know he's inspired, and I realize God could just, have anybody write what actually happened. I understand that. But when John went around and talked to people, do you think he actually found people who remembered what Anna said? I think he did. Do you think he found people who remembered what Simeon said? I think he did. And how did he find people who knew what those people said? Because they were old people, 60 years before Luke's investigating this gospel. How would you know what some old guy said in Mulvane 60 years ago? We'd ask Claude. We could, right? Claude, 60 years ago, Claude was 20 years old, 25 years old. So are there a few people who can remember these things? Are these stories passed down and passed around? I'm almost completely convinced in my own mind that somebody wrote these things down. Wouldn't you want a record of that? And we're dealing with a culture. How many people are literate in this culture? Quite a few. We got whole classes of scribes. Ben? That's right.
And everybody will know without a shadow of doubt that is the Christ, the Son of God. Where back at this time, even 60 years later, I bet Luke has gone around and gone, yeah, we remember that guy, and there's a lot of speculation.
Right. Yeah, does this, we read Luke, right? We read Luke chapter 1. Does this read like a fairy tale? Does any of this read like a fable? What? It doesn't read at all. It reads. I'm not a classicist. I haven't read, a great amount of ancient literature. Mostly it's been in regard to Bible study. But I've read some Josephus, and I've read some Cicero, and I've read some Suetonius and Herodotus and the like. This sounds like a better version of those guys. Right, it's definitely not once upon a time in a land far away. It's I am the angel Gabriel who stands before you. And one of the things that we'd see, it's usually a point made about the apostles, but it's a point all through the Scripture. These are our heroes. I mean, these are people we count as faithful. These are people that we learn so much from. And the very first one, Zechariah, the very first one, what's his first words? It's words of doubt, isn't it? It's words of doubt. If you were going to write a fable to try and make John's family look good, and make Jesus' family look good, and make Jesus look good, and all those, wouldn't you have the first guy in the story? Wouldn't you have him be a great hero of faith? I don't know. Have any of y'all ever read any of the Book of Mormon? I got to tell you, it doesn't read like this. It reads more like a bad comic book when you read about those characters that Joseph Smith invented to carry on the faith, and the Nephites and the Naphtalites and all those other things that he invents. It reads in an entirely different way. And so here we have this Jesus, as we pointed out in Luke, the perfect man set in real time and place.